In 2023, I saw a lot of stuff, and of that stuff, the Mandela Catalogue was tied for my favourite, alongside Hot Fuzz. If you've seen Hot Fuzz, you know that's pretty high praise. This series combines fantastic visuals with terrifying horror concepts and a really memorable storyline. It's definitely gotten a lot of attention over the years, but I wouldn't call it overrated at all. It's like the Beatles. It feels really generic now, despite the quality, but that's because it started a lot of these trends. All that germaface and bathroom sign people came straight from here. While I definitely understand a lot of the criticism for this series, I completely disagree with it, because of how effective it can be. And so, with the release of Volume 5 and Volume 6 coming hopefully soon, I decided what better way to pay homage to this series than to rank all of the episodes from worst to best. I'll only be ranking the canon episodes, so unfortunately no original Volume 1. That does mean there were some pretty obscure episodes that I hadn't actually seen before starting this list. Overall, all the episodes were good, but some obviously had a lot less effort put in. For example, the 20-second video was a little less impressive than the 40-minute video, so a lot of the simpler videos will be at the bottom, which we can just skim through. Finally, these are just my opinions. I've seen many different thoughts about this series, so chances are yours and mine aren't going to match up perfectly. If you feel so inclined to do so, I'd love to see your take in the comments. One of my favourite things is film discussion, and the Mandela Catalogue has a lot to discuss. With that said, grab your baseball bat, throw out your cross, and let's get straight into ranking them. Now, something interesting I found is that the 4 bottom spots on this list are the 4 videos that you can't actually find on Alex Kister's channel. I just thought that was kind of funny. Anyways, Jesus is Born is the only Mandela Catalogue episode I'd consider not good. The others are just unimportant at worst. Jesus is Born uses a similar technique to Overthrone, with Gabriel's censorship and even the exact same clips from the exact same cartoon. It gets the same points across, just far less effectively or cleverly. The long silence at the end is apprehensive, I'll give it that, but nothing more. I just don't really see what this added. You could argue the other unimportant episodes at least look at topics not focused on in other episode. There's plenty of emphasis on Gabriel and the Shepherds in episodes like Overthrown and Volume 4, so once again, I don't quite see the point. Pretty disappointing to know this series isn't completely perfect. Anyways, nothing that bad. Moving on. Nothing to report here. I think the incredibly low quality works quite well, and the imagery would have worked pretty well in a more significant Mandela Catalogue installment, but other than that, nothing to say. Nothing much to say about this one either. Didn't even know it existed before seeing it in fandom. It just expands the lore and has some pretty nice presentations, but another skim. Okay, this is the first one that I actually think is kind of effective. The realistic preacher face is incredibly disturbing and well designed. I thought the audio cut was pretty well done, and the Gabriel voice distortion was a nice add-on. The colour loss and extended muteness was kinda generic, but wasn't that bad. I think this is really only iconic for this shot, but man is it great. I love when horror things leave creepy stuff to the side of the frame. It's just so much more realistic and effective. It is, at the end of the day, another small little background story, but I thought it was better than any of the others, and it'll stick with me for a while. Exhibition was one of the few episodes which I had seen before writing the script for this video, but had to rewatch, and it kinda surprised me because it is pretty good. The found footage is always welcome, silences are used very effectively, and the ending segment is pretty intense. I just think this episode is far less memorable than some of the other shortish episodes, because it doesn't introduce many new concepts, and what it does introduce isn't really referenced in many other episodes. It's a more detailed version of Overthrown, essentially, looking at the introduction of alternates into the world and Gabriel's religious power. While I think it effectively does that, I don't find myself rewatching any scenes or even thinking that much about this episode at all. One of the things that becomes quite apparent is that it is actively trying to be scary. Some of the best episodes feel more like they are presenting scary information rather than twisting an existing situation into becoming scary. For example, in Exhibition, the Jesus is Born clips turning black and white is a clear, you should be afraid moment, and I believe it could have been more effective if it were more subtle, like the story of Easter. Nonetheless, this is a fine episode, if only a little skippable. Interlude is similar to Exhibition, in the sense that they're both slightly unmemorable or slightly unfocused epilogues. I thought Interlude was better because it looks more at unique concepts and is incredibly dread-inducing. The population steadily decreasing was pretty Gabriel Down confronting, and set down the tone in background for Volume 4 perfectly. Fits very well with the kawaii bird calling in the Volume 5 teaser, apologize if I mispronounce that name. The assimilation sequence is very iconic, and what really comes to mind when I think Interlude. The faces are all very creepy there, and I do love me some preachy content. That thing needs more representation. But as is, I just think it's more of an omen than an exciting episode. Every Day Gets Brighter is a simple yet highly effective epilogue to Volume 333. I like the climax of Volume 333 a lot, so this added on quite a bit of extra detail which I appreciated. There's not much to say about this one, it's more emotional and less subtle than the other ones. Usually being unsubtle isn't great, but after a lot of theorizing and wondering if you know what's going on, it's nice to get an honest-to-Gabriel deep delve into the character's mind. Like Interlude, this episode sets the tone for Volume 4 well, seeing as it's more character-driven than the previous installments. This does a great job at building character. In 333, Thatcher was really putting on a brave and professional facade during all of the events, so seeing him unload paints him as very real. The script hits pretty close to home at certain points, and it's instantly memorable. There are many interesting moments, like when he says we're all in the same effing boat, which probably isn't a reference to anything of importance. I just feel like this isn't what we usually get out of the series, and alongside that, it's pretty good. I'd recommend a rewatch because it's definitely underrated. Okay, have I a story for you? I first watched the Mandela Catalogue series with a good friend of mine back when Every Day Gets Brighter was the newest one. I then rewatched it with them last year, this time up to Presto, so Mandela Catalogue is a significant part of our friendship. Well, I was hanging out at their house with another person, and we were looking at YouTube, and that's when we saw this brand new Alex Kister upload. We immediately freaked out and started watching, while the other person was just sitting there confused. Anyways, we got into it a little more and realized it was just a Vine compilation, like, no scary, just funny Vines. This was obviously hilarious, and we started joking about it. Oh, Alex just accidentally uploaded a Vine comp. And then it cut to this part, and we were engrossed, while the other person remained in a state of confusion. We were thinking, oh, this must have been where Adam was kidnapped. Maybe it's his perspective. Is that the intruder? And the other person is just, I'm afraid. Anyways, we got to the door shot, and a hard cut back to Vine comp. We keep on watching just in case, obviously, but we could not stop laughing at this thing. By far the funniest Mandela Catalogue experience I've ever had. Anyways, blah blah, very creepy, great sound design, the last couple of shots are really well done, fantastic idea, all that good stuff, blah blah blah. Presto is an incredibly stressful episode and follows pretty well from Catalyst. It takes the groundbreaking things introduced in both Volume 4 and logically looks at the consequences. The episode isn't very long, so it doesn't get much time to do this, but what it does is definitely pretty great. I expect there'll be a few more consequences for this in Volume 6, but for now, I think this is a pretty good epilogue to 4. I noticed that a lot of the volumes have their own little epilogue, which is kind of fun. Volume 1 is Exhibition, 333 is Every Day Gets Brighter, and 4 has Catalyst and Presto. Anyways, the Adam imagery during the interrogation segment is fantastic, and the Thatcher imagery isn't as fantastic. I assume the Thatcher shots were CGI first time around, but it can be excused because of this bloody screenshot. Look at this and tell me you aren't going to die within the next 13 hours. Adam's God is straight chills, and the urban tragedy is one of the most foreboding moments in the entire series. The combination of the operatic soundtrack, low pixel rate, and conflicting tones makes it so intense to watch. I like how they make fun of Dave's mustache. Ha! Screw him. Presto is very similar to Mandela Catalyst, and while I don't think it's as good, I still think it's a fantastic episode and got me really excited for Volume 5 and especially 6. The very first Mand episode, and it really holds up. It's obviously pretty short, but it used the analog horror format really nicely to condense a lot of information into a short video for others to figure out. It laid out the groundwork for how the rest of the series was going to operate, and I'm pretty proud of it for doing that. It has all the hallmarks, those faces, electronic voices, a couple rewatches necessary, and creepy stuff you don't notice the first time around. It's the most Mandela Catalogue-ish Logicatish episode to have ever Mandelayed in Catalogue County Mandela Catadella. It sets up Gabriel as a villain really well and makes him a perfectly intimidating character. I feel like Gabriel is pretty underplayed at where we are now because he's been pretty heavily overshadowed by the Intruder in the alternate. But this was back in a time where Gabriel was the only villain. He was the star of the show, and it's super evident. If he had been built up more like he was in this episode, I think he would be more fondly remembered by fans. I really like how little sense it makes at first, and how obvious the true story seems once you have all the background information. I think that's less present in current episodes because we already know the conflict and the characters. The visuals are also really well done here. It's less realistic and horrific than other episodes, but it can work on pure Uncanny Valley vibes and terror, which suits the tone very well. Anyways, great opener that let the floodgates open. The Mandela Catalogue Volume 4 confuses me to no end, because on the one hand, it has some of the most interesting reveals and most terrifying sequences and some of the best acting in the entire series, and then it also has Dave. Like Dave was just a joke, right? His scenes were supposed to be cut, right? I get thrown off a bit when people discuss Dave as though he's an official part of the series, and then I have to quickly remind myself that he is an official part of the series, and I've just been pretending like he hasn't. He really doesn't mesh well with the tone of this episode. In fact, there are a lot of things that don't mesh well with the tone of this episode, or at least what it's going for. Let's look at each official volume thus far. Volume 1, an introduction to Mark, alternates, the Intruder, and the format of the series. It was supposed to be pretty episodic. Volume 2, more of a self-contained story, now using the elements we learnt in Volume 1 and building a story around it, this being of Adam and his backstory. Volume 333, a deeper dive into the Volume 1 specifics, that being Mark and the fight against alternates, and also building a second story, that being of Thatcher. Volume 4 was supposed to be a sort of dive into the Volume 2 and 333 topics, intruder forms, the alternate, the police force. However, more importantly, it was supposed to set up the two stories of Thatcher and Adam joining together. This requires a character-driven story, which requires good characters. Adam is certainly that, a four-dimensional, complicated protagonist with a good 15 grand worth of lore. Thatcher is a little more one-note, but certainly good. I feel like Sarah and Evelyn really don't have much to do, which means their character doesn't really shine through, which is frustrating because their character is clearly supposed to shine through. In both this and future episodes, they get a lot of focus, and I feel like a lot of that hasn't been warranted. For example, Jonah immediately presented himself as a defined character with his unprofessionalism. Adam then had a bit of character with his stubbornness and curiosity about the door and house. This was built on. Thatcher had all the character he needed with his facade shifting slightly during the alternate attack. Not only that, but Every Day Gets Brighter was a full episode to give him character. Both Evelyn and Sarah haven't gotten one of those moments. They're just reacting accordingly to being mistreated and being worried for their friend, which doesn't really give the viewer enough reason to root for them or be interested in their actions. Then there's Dave, but I think you know what's wrong with Dave. Anyway, been rambling on the same point for long enough. I feel like there's a select amount of absolutely fantastic scenes, and then there's a fair amount of frustrating, not all that great scenes. I really didn't love all of the moments where there was standard filming, like you can see here. I just think found footage is a bit better in analog horror, and seeing just standard shots spooked me out of the story a bit. The visual style also wasn't perfect yet. While it is unique, and it looks good at points, it also doesn't look great at many points too. The length makes it so some of the sections drag a little bit, like some of the typing moments or the face studio part, but the visuals in those scenes are so engaging that it's not that big of a deal. The only scene I really disliked in general was the Gabriel and Dave scene. The combo of Gabriel's new voice, Dave as a character, and the fact that this was kind of a worse version of the Intruder monologue that comes just a little later, the scene just took me out of the series a bit. However, it does kill off Dave, so that's kind of epic. And that's not to say everything is bad, there are a lot of genuinely terrifying moments. Adam's remembrance video is really confusing and apprehensive, and I find myself coming back to his vocal performance a lot. The alternate stalking Thatcher is so well done because you really have to focus to make out the shape of it, and the long stretches of silence have you listening for movement. This makes it so you're simultaneously heavily focused on video and audio, while also being wary of a jump scare at any moment. The Intruder monologue is nothing short of cinematic. The speech is flawless, it ends fantastically, it's the perfect finish to Volume 4, the twist is absolutely insane, and the little visual callbacks are super effective. Also, I did a little thing with it, if you want to see.
I made myself known. Do you remember my touch? I cradled him in my arms. My sweet boy. I took him away.
I know I kind of made fun of it, but the green screen visuals and all of that is pretty iconic, and I love this kind of indie imagery popping up more in this series. All in all, definitely a flawed episode, but it has some absolutely fantastic elements. I'm counting the restored version of Mandela Catalogue as if it were the very first one, so introducing Mark and Caesar, toddler assessment, all that good stuff. In that case, Volume 1 is the most iconic installment in the series. I think that this has a bit less personality than some of the later installments, which is to be expected, but still leaves a bit to be desired. Like in Mandela Catalyst, when Adam's screaming and there's a stutter effect showing the suspect identified growing and then hard cut to the white background with Smiley, that's just dripping with Alex Kister personality that you can't find anywhere else. Meanwhile, this is just a good analog horror. I think a lot of other attempted analog horrors feel so boring because they all take inspiration from this one video, and there's not a lot to take from. I think the toddler assessment portion goes on a little too long, though it manages to set up a lot of conflict. The government announcement is really iconic, though so much better in the original version. Nothing quite compares to what the K means in the original one, if you know what I mean. The same thing with the dispatcher instructional guide, which really effectively sets up how dangerous alternates can be. However, I still reckon the Mark and Caesar part is the best part. It shows everything and tells nearly nothing, which is exactly how analog horror should be. The limited vision from the camera is really intense, and missing movement helps with the feel this segment gives. This was in a time really before there was any video in the series. It was all pretty much just still images, especially for alternates. Not revealing what alternates look like immediately is quite important, especially considering they looked pretty goofy in 333. Having proof that these things should be feared is important, because just expecting the audience to agree with you isn't going to work. Also, this is kind of off topic, but I've never understood people who said Mark or Caesar is their favourite character. Like, what's good about them? They're plot devices to introduce the world, not characters. There's nothing special about either of them. Like, am I missing something? Mark gets a bit of development in 333, but if you like him because of that, you just like the line in his journal. Tell me one distinct character trait of Mark or Caesar, and I'll take the risk. Anyways, this episode has a lot of great segments, and while it lacks the character that later episodes have, it's a super effective horror story. Oh my Gabriel, did they just murder Tyler Osborne in a recording studio? Like, I'm 30% not joking, because those screams are just too raw to have been acting. Just listen to this. Like, humans could only make those noises if they drank bleach, got possessed, had some funky stuff happen to their eyes, broke every bone in their body, and got 8 second-degree burns on top of that. I think it was this specifically that I realized the acting is one of the best parts of TMC. Anyways, Mandela Catalyst. It's shockingly amazing. I say shockingly amazing because most shorter episodes aren't as good as volumes, but this episode stands toe-to-toe with the greats. If we considered the 3 endings for Volume 4, those being the Intruder Reveal, Mandela Catalyst, and Presto, I'd have to call this one my favourite. Ending with such a ginormous cliffhanger and giant burst of manic energy that keeps us waiting for years feels like such a good way to build hype for Volume 6, and Catalyst does that best out of all of these. Not only on Adam and Thatcher's storyline, but for everything. What Gabriel did to Dave is touched on, the Intruder's mass hijacking, Gabriel just twisting everything in general. Once again, Gabriel is severely forgotten, and I think his intuition scene is proof of his uncanny and creepy potential. That whole scene is just so creative with how it gets to fill in what he's actually saying. It's very easy to ignore the first part of this installment because the ending really overshadows it all, and while the ending is the best part, I think it's good to see the value in everything else. But enough about everything else. The cuts between silences and overbearing volume is fantastic. The screaming throws all this show-stopping information right into your mind, and the silence forces you to mull it over and actually comprehend what's happening. Adam's nonchalant face with the most animalistic screams I've ever heard are a great way to show how he's alternate but not quite. The found footage POV really give you nothing to protect yourself with and fits the moment perfectly. The slow zoom into this being that might be Adam is really tense as well, and the suspect identified is the first safety blanket you're given before it's ripped right out of your grasp by Adam's screams. The stutter effect with the suspect identified returning haphazardly is borderline overstimulating, and this white screen with the toddler assessment smiley is downright chilling. Okay, on to number 4. I'm slightly conflicted with Volume 2. I obviously disagree with the many people who dislike it. I feel like an episode with a more central plot was necessary to make sure this wasn't just another horror series, and both Adam and Jonah serve as good protagonists. The only problem is they aren't great protagonists, until about halfway through. This is where most of the conflict appears. I feel like the first 10 minutes are just good, the next 5 minutes are great, and then the final 5 minutes are quite literally perfection. By that point, the characters have broken down enough to be able to see them as real people, and the threat has been defined enough for it to be effective. To start off with, Adam and Jonah. I love Jonah's "oh hell yeah!" Anyways, in other news, I think that both actors are fantastic in dramatic moments, which is especially good for Adam as his entire storyline past this episode is dramatic moments. But it does mean that the more relaxed portions of this episode tend to have less strong acting, which detracts from the episode slightly. Adam's fixation is certainly interesting, but I think Jonah is really the best character in this volume. His arrogance is very interesting because of how it ties back to the theme of never letting the alternates know anything about you. In theory, arrogance or overconfidence would be a great strategy. We see this primarily in Jonah, but also in Thatcher's professionalism and Adam in Volume 4. While this strategy seems great in theory, at the end of the day, it's still acting. And once the act pauses, the alternates know exactly who you are. We can see this when Jonah's confident nature falters whenever a cat is mentioned. The alternates used his fear to alienate him from Adam and control his every move so he could be swiftly exterminated, which is just so Gabriel damn cool. Also, Jonah may have caused Adam to become a kind of antichrist because he was a dog person, which is kind of funny. Anyways, moving from the protagonists, the next most interesting part of the episode for me was the antagonist. This is quite an intruder-centric episode, which is very cool. Personally, I think some Gabriel inclusion could have been more helpful, especially near the end. I thought the idea of Satan himself coming down to torment and guilt this guy was a sick idea, and the voice kind of backed that up since it was similar to Overthrone in Exhibition. Despite this, with what we know now, the Intruder is a much more fitting antagonist. It turns the episode from alternates doing alternate stuff to an insidious plot that the Intruder is meticulously crafting. Its general air of imperceptibility and immortality is most poignant in this episode, geez, those were some big words, and the way it's able to control everything about these people is incredibly unnerving to watch. Speaking of incredibly unnerving to watch, many of the silences and imagery in this episode is really disturbing. It doesn't pack quite the same punch as some of the more disturbing episodes, but uses a more rum and ginger punch. Sharp, sweet, and unexpected. Because Adam and Jonah talk at conversation level for most of the episode, when Jonah screams, "Oh my god, behind you!" it's genuinely unexpected. The preacher jump scare works so well in context. You're expecting something to come through a door or something to attack Adam or anything to appear, and then it's just a terrifying image, nothing physical. This is so confusing in the moment, and the image is so delightfully creepy that it stays in your mind forever. Adam and Jonah's argument isn't creepy, but it has some of the best acting in anything ever, so I thought it necessary to bring up. The Intruder's lines at the very end, "Don't you remember me? Do you understand?" just fit the unnatural and cinematic feeling of this section perfectly. Jonah's car ride, his growing panic, the Intruder's insistent demands, the camera deterioration. Oh, it's so good! This episode isn't perfect at the start, but it sure as hell is at the end. It has essentially everything that makes this series great. Fantastic acting, creepy imagery, terrifying moments, and painfully realistic dialogue. I'm writing this part of the script on the day of the premiere, so there may be a bit of recency bias, but I do think that Volume 5 is so refreshing for this series. This whole episode is a mini fresh start. It introduces so many new concepts and builds on so many pre-existing ideas, including but not limited to Officer Booker, Nicholas Beringer, the Shepherd, the Dead Lamb Metaphor, Timuril, Midwestern Relocation Services, and Jude's Survivors Guild. Speaking of Jude, having him as a protagonist was a perfect choice. I think he was a little too depressed, and we've kind of seen that enough with Thatcher and Adam, but his POV is often ignored, and my goodness was there a lot going on there. His guilt and encounters were very intriguing, and seeing the alternates take advantage of that was absolutely fantastic. Jude was very justified in his actions, and the growing paranoia over what's real and not really begins to affect the viewer by the end. But Jude isn't the only depressed protagonist. We also have this guy, who I believe is the Shepherd. While he's pretty generic, his claymation art style and biblical story very much aren't. I always appreciate more backstory for this series, especially when the backstory involves Gabriel. He finally has some good inclusion. His interactions with the Shepherd are so creepy, and his torment is so well done. The callback to the Tomb of Infinite Sam had me going absolutely ballistic during the premiere, and I'd say his "How do I know you're holy" line is just as good, if not better, than who I've been praying to all this time. My friend and I specifically liked this shot of Gabriel looking down and the Shepherd's subsequent reaction of immediately averting his eyes. It just really built Gabriel's infinite power over these people into frame. Anyways, moving from one villain to another, what is this thing? Is it the alternate? I always thought that it was the preacher and it appeared to people with MAD. Honestly, I think it's a bit of both, but we'll refer to this thing as the alternate because that seems to be pretty widely accepted. And yeah, this scene is one of the scariest moments in the series, up there with the chase in 333. This is a prime example of how the alternates put a lot more effort into torturing their victims and much less into the actual act of killing them. The strain put on his Survivors Guild, along with the hallucinations and the one physical component, is so incredibly confusing and makes the viewer unsure of what can hurt them and what can't. Also, the imagery, my God! It's improved so much from the strange Volume 333 CGI, and then to the engaging parts in 4, and now this. The slow frame rate is so disorientating and doesn't let you know what's truly happening, just like Jude. The part with the strange ripple making the alternate's face fold back in on itself just works, I don't know what else to say. And look at this image and tell me this video won't cause ghosts to infiltrate your home. I didn't even get to bring up the images in the Booker report, Jude's fantastic acting, and all of the fantastic editing and camera work making the safe house look just slightly uncanny. Good Gabriel, am I excited for the terrors of Volume 6 if this is the level of quality now. You know, I've always considered the Intruder to be one of the best characters in the Mandela Catalogue, but when I really got to thinking about why, I didn't have an answer. Sure, it's important throughout the entire series and has some very dramatic moments, though that was never what made it so great. It wasn't the Volume 4 monologue, even though that was great, not Volume 2, since I thought Gabriel was doing a lot of the stuff first time through, and not Stanley in 333. That just left one other appearance, one fantastic introduction, which led me to realize that Intruder Alert was one of my favourite Mandela Catalogue episodes. It's only 5 minutes long, though it arguably has the most disturbing imagery, introduces the most concepts, introduces the most characters, and has the most dramatic plot points in the entire series. It undoubtedly takes the cake for being the most disturbing. Mandela Catalogue is known for putting its characters in terrifying scenarios with little chance of survival, but this episode is the only time the series punches you in the face with a gold brick of reality wrapped in fresh lemon. I remember the first time I watched this with my friend, I was pretty confused at why the mother would just be levitating like that and found it kinda funny. I'm sure that was the intended effect too, because the next shot, while I can't specifically talk about it, was one of the most impactful cuts of my entire life. The police images with the threat levels were absolutely terrifying, especially when seeing that an entire room being covered in dark wasn't the worst it could be. This section also perfectly uses the viewer's imagination to create suspense with the victim tampering shot. All images of the intruder have become absolutely iconic and fill me with so much dread. Attributing a clearly human and mature face to all these heinous acts is such a good way to separate the intruder from any of the other villains. Gabriel has a generic biblical connotation, the alternate is uncanny, and the preacher is just monstrous. So having a villain who is completely aware of their actions makes all the encounters with them that much more intimidating. Ultimately, this installment doesn't quite get the gold medal because of its length and the fact that it starts with which has been memed to death, but in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, head, shoulders, knees, and toes does it come close. Also very close to... I didn't love 333 the first time through. I thought it was definitely scary, but it wasn't much more than that. Thatcher didn't feel all too investing, Ruth never interested me, the story was less defined, and there were no real oh my goodness parts like there were in 1, 2, and Intruder Alert. Then I watched it again and realized that this was pretty easily the best Mandela Catalogue installment, and probably the best horror short on YouTube. It has by far the most horrific and in-depth look at the themes of the series, has the most consistent characters, introduces so many ideas, and has the scariest moment in the entire series, the alternate chase. I want to start there because it's just straight perfection. The main problem with a lot of scenarios in this series is that they're gimmicky. Sure, Mark being trapped in his room was scary, but that wouldn't really happen to most people. Same thing with the intruder manipulating Adam and Jonah, what Gabriel did to Dave, and Jude's mad. It's not the kind of thing that the viewer could see happening to them. But getting chased down by an alternate? Yeah, that would have happened to almost every resident. And my goodness, the way the cameras never show the alternate alongside the unimaginably creepy rendition of Amazing Grace slowly approaching, alongside Thatcher's calls for help getting completely ignored, the panic builds up like a pot on the boil and the encounter itself is just phenomenal. The movements of the alternate are just so uncanny, and its tape recorder voice distorting subtly is just perfect. The imagery of the alternate picking up the camera and lowering from the roof as though crucified adds to its unsettling nature and wonders. And my god, this frame might just be the most terrifying frame in the entire series. Its taunting nature puts it apart from other villains so well. This isn't a cold, calculating god with everything under control. No, it's just a borderline unstoppable monster that probably has no idea what it's doing. Its strategy can't be outsmarted, for it has no strategy at all. It just wants to inflict pain onto everything that it sees. That's so very evident with its bad decision, Thatcher, and especially the victim names in the credits. Both of these made me lose my mind on rewatch. I was not emotionally prepared. That final sequence is honestly just perfect in every possible way. I haven't even touched on the first 20 minutes. People can't get enough of who have I been praying to all this time, and for good reason. It definitely is what the Mandela Catalogue is all about. All the new Mark content I thought really added on to Volume 1, which was much needed. Giving Mark some character was important, because he was pretty cookie cutter in Volume 1. Thatcher's friendship with Ruth is really wholesome and makes her death all the more devastating. All the found footage with Thatcher's body cam was really well done, and the visual style really comes in strong with this one. In Volume 2, the found footage scenes felt a little too normal, and Volume 4 had ones that just felt like bad CGI at points. So this one had one of the few that really got it right. Everything looks uncanny, but nothing is disorienting. Having an episode that seems quite episodic, but is really a complete narrative, is such a great medium between Volume 1 and 2, and it is executed to perfection here. I guess that's the bottom line. Executed to perfection. This episode is very simple ideas that anyone can relate to or easily understand, and then uses an engaging visual style, fantastic sound design, and some of the most thought-provoking perspectives on the subjects to make one of the best analog horror videos on YouTube. Anyways, that was the Mandela Catalogue ranked. All in all, this is one of my favourite series of all time, despite the oversaturation and negative connotation to the genre. I also enjoy all of the episodes, as I just think that there aren't many ranking videos on this series, and I had some thoughts. Final thing though, why does Prelude in C major by Bach pop up so much? It plays over the Might of the Subconscious title during Thatcher's encounter, and most interestingly, it's the instrumental for the Castro recording Ave Maria, which plays both at the start of Volume 5 and the Distraught at the start of her missing infant scene. Probably some connection to the Intruder there. Anyways, thanks for sticking through this. I'll make a video on Volume 6. Wake up, Joseph. Cue the outro music.